August 6th, 2026. Nothing is burning above Summerland, British Columbia. It is an ordinary summer afternoon in the Okanagan, the lake below, orchards on the benches, tourists in the hotels, and in Victoria, the Premier of British Columbia is issuing a statement thanking Mexico for sending a second wave of firefighters. Australia has sent crews, so has New Zealand, so have Alberta, Quebec, and the Yukon, 214 people from Mexico alone. The fire that will empty this valley does not exist yet. It starts the following evening, 15 kilometers west of town, and inside 3 hours it covers 50 square kilometers. By midnight, all 12,000 residents of Summerland are ordered out. By the next afternoon, British Columbia has declared a state of emergency over its entire territory, 944,000 square kilometers, from the Yukon border to the Washington line. But look at what that declaration was actually for. Not water, not aircraft, not crews. The minister who signed it said the powers it unlocked were the ability to commandeer accommodations and to bring in local travel restrictions. Hotel rooms, roads. A government does not reach for that because a fire got large. It reaches for it when there is nothing left to reach for. This is the story of the summer British Columbia ran out. To understand what happened in the South Okanagan on the night of August 7th, 2026, you have to go back 2 days to a moment when nothing at all was on fire above Summerland, and the province of British Columbia was already asking other countries for help. On August 6th, the Premier of British Columbia issued a short statement welcoming a second wave of firefighters from Mexico. Alongside them came crews from Australia and New Zealand, joining personnel already working in the province from Alberta, Quebec, and the Yukon. The reported figures around that period were 214 people from Mexico, 34 from Australia, and 5 from New Zealand, on top of the Canadian crews already sent west. The timing is the whole story. A Canadian province was importing firefighters from 3 foreign countries and 3 other Canadian jurisdictions, and the fire that would define its summer had not started yet. The statement carried a line that would look very different 48 hours later. Wildfire conditions are challenging in many parts of the province, the Premier said, and we are bracing for difficult conditions in the weeks ahead. By the 9th of August, the provincial numbers told you what challenging meant in practice. 895 fires for the season to date, 102 still active, 45 of those out of control, 44%, a figure that describes the condition of a firefighting system far better than any single fire's acreage ever will. 2 other named incidents were burning in the same corner of the province at the same time, the Quilpatuck Creek Fire and the Bradley Creek Fire near Vernon, all of them competing for the same crews and the same aircraft. There is an assumption buried underneath the way wealthy countries fight fire. The system works by moving surplus. Australia and New Zealand can send crews north in July and August precisely because their own season runs in the southern summer. Alberta can help British Columbia because their peaks do not usually align. The arrangement rests on the idea that everyone will not be on fire at once. That half held. The domestic half did not. By the first week of August, British Columbia had drawn down its own reserve, then Canada's, then reached overseas. A second wave from Mexico is what the far end of that pool looks like. So when a fire started west of Summerland, on the evening of August 7th, it did not arrive at a province with depth behind it. It arrived at a province that had already spent everything it had. The South Okanagan is a long, narrow trench in the interior of British Columbia, running roughly north to south, with Okanagan Lake along the bottom of it. Summerland sits on the western shore. The hills climb steeply from the water on both sides, and it is in those hills, about 15 kilometers west of town, that this fire began. Valley shape matters here in 3 ways, and all 3 would show up over the following 48 hours. A narrow valley channels wind along its axis, so weather arrives as a directed push rather than a diffuse breeze. It traps cold air at the bottom on clear nights, producing what meteorologists call an inversion, and it puts towns at the foot of slopes, a fine place to live and a terrible place to be downhill of a fire. The ground itself had been prepared for months. Since late May, the Okanagan had been sitting at drought level 5. The highest rating on the provincial scale, and at that time the only basin in British Columbia to hold it. Okanagan Lake and Kalamalka Lake were both measuring below their historic lows in early August, barely halfway through the dry season. The Okanagan Basin Water Board was describing severe water scarcity, with several more weeks of hot, dry weather still forecast. There is a detail in that which is easy to skim past. The aircraft that fight fires in this valley scoop their water out of those same lakes. The drought that dried the fuel was lowering the water they would use to fight it. Nobody in Summerland was doing anything wrong on the 6th of August. The town was going about an ordinary summer, but every condition that turns an ignition into a catastrophe was already in place and had been for weeks. At around 5:15 on the evening of Friday, August 7th, police responded to reports of a fast-moving fire in the hills west of Summerland. Within roughly 3 hours of that first report, the fire covered approximately 50 square kilometers. That number deserves to sit on its own because it is genuinely difficult to picture. 50 square kilometers in 3 hours is not a fire spreading. It is a fire running. Crews arriving at an incident like that are not deciding where to build a line. They are deciding which direction to retreat in, and whether there is anything between the flame front and a town that can be defended at all. Through the night of the 7th and into the 8th, the fire nearly doubled again. The cause remained under investigation. None was determined or announced in those first days, and there is a reason to be patient about that which will matter later. What the fire had going for it was a set of conditions the BC Wildfire Service would describe in unusually blunt language. Fuels, the agency wrote, remain exceptionally dry and require very little wind to transition fire from the surface into the crowns of trees. Consider what that sentence admits. A crown fire, one that leaves the ground and runs through the canopy, is normally the product of a wind event. It takes a real push to lift flame into the treetops and keep it there. The agency was describing terrain where that threshold had effectively been removed. Crown fire was no longer the product of a windstorm. It was the product of a breeze, and the wind, as it turned out, was going to do considerably more than breathe. At 35 minutes past midnight on Saturday, August 8th, the entire district of Summerland was placed under an evacuation order. Not a neighborhood, not the western edge nearest the fire. The whole community, more than 12,000 people, 5,688 properties, told in the middle of the night to get out. Roughly 8,000 more people in and around Peachland were ordered out as well. Try to hold the practical shape of that. 12,000 people, most of them asleep, woken by phones and door knocks and expected to make a series of irreversible decisions in a few minutes each. What do you take? Where are the documents? Where's the cat? Which road is still open? Highway 97, the main artery through the valley, was closed. Every one of those households was choosing in the dark while an orange line moved on the ridge above them. By 9:30 that evening, all 5,688 Summerland properties were under order, with another 416 under order and 1,100 under alert in the surrounding regional district. At 7 in the evening on August 8th, the BC Wildfire Service mapped the fire at 10,340 hectares, about 103 square kilometers, or roughly 25,500 acres. Hold on to that figure and on to the time attached to it, because the gap between when a number is measured and when the public reads it becomes part of this story. Somewhere in the middle of that day, between the midnight evacuation order and the evening mapping flight, the government of British Columbia did something that had only been done 5 times before in 23 years. At 1:35 in the afternoon on Saturday, August 8th, British Columbia declared a state of provincial emergency. The declaration was made by Kelly Green, the Minister of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, and announced from the office of the Premier in Victoria. Its scope was the part that startled anyone who read past the headline. It did not cover Summerland, or the South Okanagan, or the regional districts where the fire was burning. It covered the entire province, all 944,735 square kilometers of British Columbia, from the Yukon border to the Washington line, including hundreds of communities where the air was clear and nothing whatsoever was on fire. Most people hear state of emergency and understand it as a description. A government saying this is very bad. An official adjective pressed onto something that has already earned it. That is not what a state of emergency is. It is a legal instrument. It transfers specific powers to the people who declare it. And the powers it transfers tell you, with a precision no press conference ever manages, exactly what a government believes it is about to be unable to do. So it is worth listening carefully to what Minister Green said those powers were. It will give us the ability to do things like commandeer accommodations, she said, or bring in local travel restrictions. Nothing in commandeering accommodations puts water on a fire. Nothing in a travel restriction cuts a fire line. Neither power is aimed at the flame front at all. Both are aimed at people who are nowhere near it, in towns that are perfectly safe, occupying hotel rooms and driving on roads the province suddenly needed. British Columbia did not declare an emergency because a fire had grown large. It declared an emergency because it needed legal authority to take hotel rooms from families who had booked them months earlier and to close roads to people who wanted to use them so that it could house and move 21,700 displaced residents. There is a reason this had to be provincial rather than local. A local authority can already declare its own emergency and order its own residents out. Summerland had done exactly that at midnight. What a local declaration cannot do is reach across a boundary and requisition something belonging to a community that is not itself in danger. That reach is the entire point. And the moment a government takes it, it has said something out loud about itself. This emergency can no longer be resourced from inside the emergency zone. That is not a statement about how big a fire is. It is a statement about how much is left. By the afternoon of the declaration, provincial officials had confirmed something that changes the texture of everything else. There were still people inside the fire's perimeter. Some had chosen not to leave when the order came. Some had been cut off. The fire crossed the road out before they could use it. The Premier's language in the August 8th statement was direct. "Our immediate priority is protecting lives and supporting rescue efforts," he said. "Air evacuations are underway for people who remain isolated behind the fire perimeter." Picture the operation that sentence describes. 18 aircraft working over a valley filled with smoke on a fire classified as out of control, lifting more than 50 people off ground that could not be reached any other way. That was happening in the same hour a minister in Victoria was signing a document about hotel rooms. On the ground, tactical evacuations were run by RCMP officers from the Penticton and Summerland detachments, with support pulled in from Kelowna and West Kelowna, from BC Highway Patrol, from RCMP Federal Policing, from Southeast District RCMP, and from the Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit's Uniformed Gang Enforcement Team. That last detail says a great deal without meaning to. A specialized organized crime unit was reassigned to drive into a burning valley and pull people out of houses because on that afternoon there was nobody else left to send. One thread out of those hours has to be handled carefully. Southeast District RCMP stated they were aware of a resident of Meadow Valley who had reported a possible fatality connected to the fire. Hazardous conditions were making confirmation difficult, and the RCMP and the BC Coroner Service were working to establish what had happened. It was unconfirmed, and it should be held that way, because if it turns out to be true, it belongs to a family, not to a headline. The Premier acknowledged the same uncertainty from the other direction. "We know there have been significant losses of homes and property," he said. "We also know that some people became trapped as conditions changed quickly. By then, the fire had already done the thing that made all of it possible. It had learned to burn at night." Wildfire fighting in North America is built on a single reliable gift, and the gift is darkness. When the sun goes down, temperatures fall and relative humidity climbs. Fine fuels pull moisture back out of the air. Flame lengths drop, the rate of spread collapses, and a fire that spent the afternoon running through the canopy lies down and smolders. That window is when the real work happens. Crews build line, aircraft reposition. Exhausted people get relieved. Almost every containment strategy on the continent assumes that window will arrive. On the night of August 8th into the 9th, it did not arrive. The BC Wildfire Service put it in the flat, procedural language these bulletins use. Last night, poor overnight recoveries were observed on the Bald Range wildfire, with relative humidity around 33%. The south end of the fire, along with the Fish Lake Road and Garnet Valley Road areas, continued to experience increased fire behavior overnight. 33% humidity at night is not a recovery. It is a mild afternoon that happens to be dark. Underneath that number is a valley in a level 5 drought where the fine fuels, grass, needles, small dead branches, all of which respond to the atmosphere within about an hour, sit at their absolute minimum, and so do the heavier fuels that normally take days to dry. There is no moisture left in the system to absorb the day's heat. Every unit of energy that arrives goes into preheating the next thing that will burn. That is also the physical reason a breeze can now do what used to take a windstorm. The latter fuels between the ground and the canopy are as dry as the ground itself. One more thing was working in the fire's favor and against it at the same time. The valley had an inversion, cold air pooled at the bottom, warmer air on top, and the fire's own smoke trapped underneath the lid. That smoke layer was shading the ground, holding temperatures down and humidity up. In the most unsettling sense possible, the fire's smoke was suppressing the fire. The BC Wildfire Service knew how fragile that was, and said so in its forecast for August 9th. Light upslope easterly winds are forecasted to develop this morning, before shifting to brisk westerlies later in the day and continuing overnight. If skies clear, fire behavior will increase significantly due to the breaking of an inversion and resulting in increased winds. That forecast contains two problems arriving together. When an inversion breaks, the shading disappears, and the surface is exposed to full sun and to winds that had been sitting above it all along. The transition is not gradual. The second problem is worse, a wind reversal. A fire pushed steadily from one direction develops a defined head and two long flanks, and suppression is organized around that geometry. Reverse the wind, and the flank crews have worked for 2 days, becomes the new head. Several kilometers of fire edge stop being a side and start being a front all at once. By roughly 20 past 11 that morning, the estimate stood at 13,618 hectares, still out of control. That is the second number, and it is not the same kind of number as the first. 10,340 hectares was a mapped perimeter. 13,618 was an estimate. Both were real. On a fire, moving like this one, the measurement system runs behind the fire, and the public reads figures describing something that no longer exists at that size. While the fire was doing that, 12,000 people were sitting in gymnasiums and parking lots and relatives' spare rooms, trying to find out whether their town still existed. They could not go and look. That is the specific cruelty of a full community evacuation. The people who would normally be the eyes on a place have all been removed from it. Into that vacuum came the thing that always comes. Reports circulated online claiming Summerland had been destroyed. Graham Statt, the chief administrative officer of the district of Summerland, had been downtown the previous night. He put his name to a correction. "There's no visible damage that I can see," he said. "Downtown Summerland hasn't been destroyed." It is worth pausing on what that job actually was. On August 9th, Graham Statt was the only pair of eyes 12,000 evacuated people had. Not a spokesman for a position. A man who had physically stood on a street and could therefore say what was on it. What he could not say was the rest. Homes and other buildings had been lost in Garnet Valley and in Prairie Valley, both inside Summerland's own boundaries. The rural community of Falder, west of town, was described as devastated. Damage assessment was still underway. No number was issued, and it is worth being honest about why. The assessment had not been done, crews could not safely walk the ground, and handing a wrong figure to a family waiting to hear about their house is a real harm. The absence of a number in those first days was not evasion, it was the only responsible answer available. 21,700 people were displaced across British Columbia. Another 9,700 sat on evacuation alert, packed, waiting. Most of the South Okanagan's evacuees landed in Penticton, a city that had not planned on absorbing a neighboring town overnight. Reception centers there were described as very busy and struggling with the influx. Eric Thompson, the emergency information officer for the regional district of Okanagan's Similkameen, called the situation unprecedented for the South Okanagan. And then he said the thing that quietly reframes the entire response. "When you go to the reception center, you are going to be met by a lot of other people doing the same," he said. "Remember, please, it's a volunteer-run program." A town of 12,000 was absorbed by volunteers. The system that caught more than 20,000 displaced people was not, in any meaningful sense, a system. It was neighbors with clipboards, registering other neighbors in a building never built for it. Around them, the machinery of improvisation went up fast. The city of Penticton asked registered evacuees to move on from the trade and convention center once they had signed in, so staff could keep processing arrivals. A comfort center opened at Princess Margaret Secondary School. Washrooms, playgrounds, water, snacks, somewhere to charge a phone, somewhere indoors to sit. Overflow parking for trucks and recreational vehicles was designated at 4 sites, including Kings Park and Skaha Lake Park. And this is where the declaration signed in. Victoria stops being an abstraction. Every one of those people needed a bed. There were not enough beds in the valley in the middle of August, in a tourist region at the height of its season. The power to commandeer accommodations was not a theoretical instrument of state authority. It was the answer to a concrete question: where did 20,000 people sleep tonight? British Columbia has declared a wildfire-driven provincial state of emergency 6 times. In 2003, 2017, 2018, 2021, 2023, and now 2026. Look at how those years sit. 2003 was the Okanagan Mountain Park fire season, and it was the last such declaration for 14 years. Then 2017, declared July 7th, lifted September 15th, about 10 weeks, the longest in the province's history. Then 2018 broke its record. Then 2021, the Lytton season. Then 2023, 28 days under declaration, the McDougall Creek year. Then this one declaration in 14 years, then 5 in 10. When a government reaches for emergency powers once in a generation, the instrument means what it was designed to mean. This is the worst thing anyone working can remember. When it reaches for them 5 times in a decade, the instrument has quietly become something else, a normal part of the operating procedure for summer. The Valley's own calendar makes the same point. The 2003 Okanagan Mountain Park fire ignited on August 16th. The 2023 McDougall Creek fire started August 15th. Those 2 weeks in the middle of August are when the fuels have had the maximum number of consecutive drying days and the atmosphere is most willing to produce the winds that move fire fast. The Bald Range fire started on August 7th, at the front edge of that window, with the worst fortnight still ahead of it. One more thing separates this declaration from most. States of emergency are usually retrospective. They respond to a disaster that has already finished expressing itself. This one was signed at 1:35 in the afternoon, while the fire was still growing and while aircraft were still lifting people out from behind the perimeter. The province was not cleaning up. It was still losing ground. The cause may take years. The investigation into the 2023 McDougall Creek fire was completed in December of 2025, more than 2 years after the flames, and returned a finding of undetermined. So the number to watch is not the hectares, and it is not even the structure count, as much as those families deserve their answer. It is the date the province lets the emergency go. 2017 held on for 10 weeks, 2021 for about 8, 2023 for 28 days. This one was declared in the first week of August, in a valley at the highest drought level the scale has. However long it runs will be the clearest public measure of how much reserve a country has left underneath it, and this is the 6th time it has had to check. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. These documentaries take real research and real care to put together, especially when the event is still moving as we make them. And if you found it worth your time, a like, a comment, or subscribe helps more than you would think. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.